Hey y'all. One of the challenges with taking on a poem like The Wasteland is figuring out how to give enough background information that you can do something with it without giving so much that you end up interpreting the poem in a particular way just because of what I've said. So I want to give you just a little bit of a background about this poem. One of the things that it probably will help to know is that when T.S. Eliot originally wrote The Wasteland, it was intended to be a good bit longer than the final version that we see, and more significantly even than that, the title of the poem was going to be He Do the Police in Different Voices. That in itself is an obscure reference, and you'll find that that's typical of Eliot's style. That's a quote from a Charles Dickens novel by the title of Our Mutual Friends, and it refers to one of the characters in that novel, a little boy by the name of Sloppy, and he would read the newspaper out loud, and his mother commented that even though he doesn't appear to be particularly intelligent, he's a very good reader because he do the police in different voices. The idea being that he could use his vocal inflections to kind of give a voice to the characters that are represented in the newspaper. What this suggests to us is that Eliot had in mind the idea that this is going to be a poem composed of multiple voices. And I can guarantee you this poem will challenge your understanding of poetic voice. It will put that to the test. It also suggests perhaps, and critics have disagreed over this, it may suggest that there is intended to be something of a single consciousness behind the whole thing. So just like Sloppy is giving different voices to the police, yet it's always one person speaking, it may be that The Wasteland is multiple voices, but always that one central voice that is tying them all together. We can talk more about that in class. One way of approaching this poem is to think of it in the tradition that we have studied so far. It's important to remember John Donne. Eliot admired Donne greatly, and he really appreciated Donne's use of the metaphysical conceit. If you remember that idea that a metaphor can be stretched almost to the breaking point, and you'll see that woven throughout The Wasteland. It might also help to think of this poem as being perhaps a synthesis of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, two American poets who wrote in the 50 or 60 years before Eliot comes onto the scene. And let me see if I can explain what I mean by that. I think that you can see clearly the emphasis of, or the influence of Whitman on Eliot's use of free verse. I think there's also kind of the cataloging effect that we saw in Whitman. Over and over, Eliot is just listing things out. One of the key differences, of course, is that Whitman is listing things out to try to make coherent sense of them. So it's, let's see how many different ways I can express American democracy. For Eliot, that doesn't always seem to be the case. And then you bring in Dickinson, and Dickinson's use of intense metaphors that absolutely force you as the reader to participate, to try to make sense of things that don't seem to make sense. If you remember the article that we read that talks about Dickinson as using the Gothic conventions to get to a modernist sense of self, you'll see that in Eliot too. Not the use of the Gothic conventions, but the sense of a self that is fractured. And that actually leads to just a few comments on the contexts of this poem. The Wasteland was written in the immediate aftermath of World War I, and Eliot, like many of his contemporaries, felt that something had happened, something awful had happened, and World War I is typically seen as ushering in the high modernist era of American and British literature. This is literature produced by a group of writers who, by and large, felt that they had been cut off from the past, that they rejected the tradition that had grown up, and in part because they rejected the tradition, they felt like they had less grounding in the past. And the literature expresses that. It expresses this sense of feeling isolated, of feeling alienated. Going right along with that is the idea that the self has somehow been fractured. Again, we talked about that with Dickinson a little bit, but the self experiences the world in multiple different ways, and that those things don't always add up to a single coherent whole picture. Um, the wasteland is seen as kind of the greatest expression of this high modernist sensibility. Um, and one of the questions you should be asking yourself as you're reading this, reflecting on back on what I've just talked about, where do the voices shift? Who are the voices? Do these fractured voices that experience the world in such very, very different ways ever come together in any kind of a coherent whole? If you read The Wasteland with those ideas in mind, I think you may find yourself a little bit less frustrated with it. Don't get me wrong, you're still going to be frustrated with it. I'm still frustrated with it. Critics are still frustrated with it. It's a frustrating but very important poem. I look forward to discussing with you and hearing what you have to say about it.